Welcome to another English language A-level video. This was the second one, introducing language discourses, getting you ready for the AQA English Language Paper 2, Section B, discourses. Now, in the last video, we talked about discourses as a concept. On this one, we're going to start with the idea of linguistic relativity. So, the use of discourses can shape an audience's view of a certain topic. Think, for example, about the language that's used to present American English as opposed to British English. The text producer may very well use some kind of discourse of conflict, and therefore the audience is being positioned to view the concept in the same way that American English somehow must be pitched against British English, and we must make some kind of value judgment about the two competing sides. Now, you could link this in with linguistic relativity, which is explained in the good old trusty AQA textbook on page 81. Sometimes it's called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, and this is the idea that language doesn't just shape somebody's viewpoints about things, but it actually determines the way that you perceive and experience. Okay, so the strong version of the linguistic relativity concept is that language determines thought. Okay, so obviously the representation of certain concepts, if for example you're picking up the Daily Mail and it's always representing American English in a negative way, you could argue that you are being positioned, you're being determined to think of language in that way. Now that's called linguistic relativity. There is a weak version of this that basically says the language that's being used is only influencing rather than completely determining your opinions. Okay, another area to think about when you're reading discourse articles is about metaphors. How are these writers using metaphorical, figurative language to shepherd you to think and feel in certain ways? And here, the research done by the linguist Jean Aitchison is particularly useful. What she came up with was 3 metaphors that basically describe some of the anxieties that prescriptivists have towards other people's language. And she called them crumbling castle, damp spoon syndrome, and infectious disease. Now, I want to stress here that Jane Aitchison herself is not a prescriptivist, because every year when people write about this, they fall into that trap of thinking that Aitchison, all she's doing is she's trying to describe some of the anxieties that others have, like prescriptivists have. Okay, crumbling castle, damp spoon syndrome, infectious disease. This is what she means. So here we've got our damp spoon syndrome. Lovely sugar bowl with a spoon inside it, but guess what? Your brother, he's had his Frosties in the morning and he's left the wet spoon in there and it's all congealed. It's disgusting. So it's lazy and it's sloppy. And so lots of people look at other people's language and say, how lazy and how sloppy is that? Notice how our language is degenerating because people just can't be bothered to be using the proper standard English forms. So they might hear an estuary English speaker saying street instead of street, and they might say, how ugly and sloppy is that? Can't they see that there is a consonant in the terminal position of this noun street? Articulate it, sound it out. So actually, if you think about that particular example, and it is explained in the textbook on page 218, this is not deletion, this is not people missing out sounds, it's actually substitution. Because if you're saying street like that, on the end there, that's a glottal stop. So it's substitution rather than laziness. And actually, when you look at multiple examples, you find that actually this thing that people are, completely lazy all the time with their language doesn't really hold up to close scrutiny. Okay, so that's the damp spoon syndrome. We then move on to our crumbling castle. There it is, how romantic. Castle that was once beautiful, in a beautiful state, and now look at it, it's been neglected and it's ruined. And this is what's happening to English, you see. English is a beautiful old building which needs preserving. Look back at the great writers of Charles Dickens and William Shakespeare. Weren't they using language in a beautiful way? And now listen to people using MLE or Geordie English or the language that they use on social media. This is the crumbling castle analogy. And it begs the question, was there ever really a golden age of language? Okay, is it fair to take, the works of Shakespeare and Dickens and to say, well, most people in the 19th or the 17th century were using language in these ways? And anyway, is a rigid system that never changes, is that better than having a flexible one that changes as society changes? The crumbling castle. And then finally, we have our infectious disease. Look at that. We know all about this, infectious diseases. This is the idea that we catch new language forms from others, and it's a kind of virus, whether it be American English forms or forms from other cultures like Jafaican, or maybe we are catching it from, communication technology forms. So younger people are using these lazy forms and other people are beginning to catch on. Okay, so this is a big anxiety that people have. And the way to analyse it is to say, yes, social contact is a driving force of change, but people are not powerless on this. They're not passive. People pick up change because they want to. Okay, so Gene Acheson's metaphors are quite useful. Now, you wouldn't spend in your language discourses question 3 an entire paragraph explaining about Gene Acheson's metaphors, but you may do some kind of passing reference. And of course, in your question 4, which is the article that you're going to be writing, more of that later, then that is your opportunity to be explaining to a non-specialist audience these sorts of ideas. You could also talk about the wonderfully Scottish name of Donald McKinnon, a linguist who characterised the language used in the media when journalists are talking about language, and suggested that a lot of it is about binary opposites, that the representations of language in the media are often this or that, correct or incorrect. You've got language that's either right or it's wrong, or language is presented as being nice and pleasant, or ugly and nasty, or language is presented as being acceptable, or unacceptable. That's either socially and morally. Language can be presented as being appropriate or inappropriate in the context. And language can also be presented as being either useful or useless to us. Now, these are useful binary opposites that Donald McKinnon came up with. So in terms of acceptability, social acceptability, notions of what is acceptable obviously changes with society. So if you think about words that represent issues to do with gender and race, words that were considered to be acceptable 50 years ago would now be deemed to be completely unacceptable today. Okay, so there is change going on there. You've also got this notion of the aesthetic responses that people have, which are very subjective towards language. People feel that new words coming into the language, take the word phablet, for example, lots of people will shirk from it and think, what an ugly sounding word that is. Or they won't like things like the double negative form that I mentioned in the last video. Or maybe they come across an accent like the Birmingham accent and they respond to it in some kind of negative way. These are not linguistic objective responses. These are very subjective responses that we've got. Okay, so let's think about the way that language discourses are represented in headlines in the national press. So what arguments are being presented in the following headlines? And what AO1 terms can we use? Now, we need to be using all of our language levels here. It's not just about lexis, but also about semantics, word meanings, pragmatics, like intertextuality and underlying meanings, discourse. I do these headlines adhere to the genre features that you'd expect them to have. What about grammar as well? What about the syntax of what's going on? There may even be phonological aspects on this which are important. So the watchword is use all of your different language levels, not just Lexis. And what kinds of similarities and differences are there between these headlines? Let's look at 4 of them. After mangling our language for years, Americans are complaining about the invasion of traditional British lingo. English is well sick. Slang, the infection that can't be cured. It's a thug life, innit? Confused parents confess they are baffled by the language their teenage sons use. The fight for English, why we must battle to save our mother tongue. Quite why I read them in different regional accents is anybody's guess. After mangling our language for years, Americans are complaining about the invasion of traditional British lingo. Now, what discourses have we got here? Invasion and violence. We have the emotive, material, progressive aspect verb mangling going on there. We have the abstract noun invasion. So language is being represented as an area of conflict between us and them, between British and American. So highly emotive, hyperbolic verbs and nouns being used. Also notice the look of the pronouns as well. So first person plural pronoun our. So it's using this discourse of ownership as if British English speakers somehow own the language. Very vague presentation of information. Americans. Now, what does that even mean? How many Americans are we talking about? Which Americans? 2 Americans? 20 Americans? 20,000 Americans? 200 million Americans? Very, very vague kind of declarative that's gone on here. Who are these Americans? And notice again the use of the progressive aspect verb here, complaining. So this is continuous action. It started in the past. It's happening now. It's going to continue in the future, complaining. And look at the emotive noun phrase on the end here, where you've got a pre-modifying adjective traditional, which give nice warm connotations, positive feelings. Oh, it's traditional. So it's linking together nice feelings with British English. And notice the rather cosy diminutive form of the word language. So we've got lingo, which you don't often hear very much these days, but if you're watching World War II war films, you might well hear people talking about lingo. So it's one of those slightly archaic forms, again, which connotes a kind of glorious British past. So highly prescriptive and also infectious disease, I suppose, as well. Next headline, English is well sick. Slang, the infection that can't be cured. So here we have the discourse. Now, when I'm talking about discourse here, I'm really talking about semantic fields. I would say the 2 of them are synonymous. So discourse and semantic fields mean pretty much the same thing. But you've got the word sick and you've got the word infection here. So again, this links in with the idea of Jean Acheson's 3rd metaphor there, that language is often presented as this disease. Okay, we've got the play on words here because we've got a word sick, this adjective, which is being used in a different way to the conventional way. So therefore it's representative of this kind of slang that is being complained about. And we have the use of the passive voice. So the infection is the victim, or rather the language is the victim of this infection. And notice the use of the modal auxiliary verb. There is no possibility that language can improve. It can't be cured. So it's a very prescriptive viewpoint that language is on the downslide and nobody can do anything about it. It's thug life, innit? Confused parents confess they are baffled by the language their teenage sons use. So it starts off with a sort of baffling statement that most of our Daily Mail readers won't understand. What does it mean, thug, in this particular sentence? We don't know, this mysterious pre-modifying adjective. And you've got the non-varying tag question as well, which kind of signals that this is young people's speech. We have the discourse of puzzlement and confusion. We've got the word pre-modifying adjective confused, and we have the mental verb baffled. So the discourse here is that other people's language is completely baffling. Okay, and look at the way that the representation of who is using this particular language. Of course, it's young people, right? So young people are being presented as the problem, and it's presented as being something that's gender specific as well. So daughters are not mentioned, but it's somehow a male problem about the way they're using language. So again, it's highly prescriptive. And the final headline, The Fight for English, Why We Must Battle to Save Our Mother Tongue. So we have the discourse here, again, conflict. So we have the abstract noun fight. We have the material verb battle. And notice the plosive sound of that battle. It really sounds like something that's quite violent. So there's slight sound iconicity going on there. So you've got a dramatic slogan at the beginning, the fight for English. Notice again the use, as in the first headline, of first person plural pronouns, we and our. So it's positioning the audience that inevitably you are going to think and feel in the same way as I do, we and our. We have the deontic modal auxiliary verb, strong sense of obligation, must battle. And it's presenting language as something that is in need of protection to save our mother tongue. And notice the positive connotations of, rather than saying language, it says mother tongue. So you've got the positive connotations of the pre-modifying adjective mother here, and you've got the metaphorical synonym for language, tongue. So again, it's representing language that seems to be degenerating. Maybe it's a crumbling castle that is in extreme need of restoration. Okay, so hopefully that's given you a bit of a flavour of the sorts of language that you'll be using in your question 3 language discourses responses. Thank you very much.